Is it recording? Fantastic. Hi, everybody. It's 1953 to 1960. And there are, I would say that I'd say there are three big topics with 1953 to 1960. One is the culture of the 1950s, American culture. American society. What is it like to live in the 1950s? What are the popular cultural touchstones of the 1950s? The other big thing in the 1950s is the beginning of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, yes, did not give up her seat, but there were other things that happened. Other very significant things that happened. And then the other aspect of the 1950s is the Cold War and how the Eisenhower administration confronts the challenge of the Russians in a different way than the Truman administration confronts the Russians. So those are the three big things: American culture, the civil rights movement, and the Cold War. Those are the big three things that we're going to look at. In terms of American culture, the 1950s is really defined by the baby boomers. You know, the average age of a person having a child in 1953 was 19 years old. That was the average age of a first-time mother, 19 years old. Can you imagine some of you folks having children in 2 years? Neither can I. Woe betide us all. Okay? But at age 19, in 1953, a lot of women were getting married. They were buying, their families were buying homes in the suburbs. Their husbands had good jobs. And you had that kind of affluence where you could have children at an early age. And look, I mean, for these young mothers, there was a huge business out there. There was a business, in baby food and baby clothes and baby furniture and all that stuff. But this is the first time you start to see the publication of baby books. How do I raise a child? And the most popular book of the time is called Baby and Child Care by Dr. Benjamin Spock. No, not the first officer of the Enterprise, not the pointy-ear guy, but Dr. Spock tried to convey to these new young American mothers how best to raise their children. And do you know what the central tenet of baby and child care was? Give the child what they want. Dear God, exactly. Dear God, indeed. Because what is the result? What have you created then?
A spoiled brat.
A spoiled brat. You've created a kid that if he whines enough, will get what he wants. And you've got an entire generation that's like that, that believes that they are entitled to things. And you know what? That gets passed down from generation to generation to generation. This idea of entitlement. So really, a lot of the baby boomer attitude of, I'm the most important, I'm special, I can do anything. Yeah, a lot of that me stuff comes from how children were raised in the 1950s. Women. Now look, women during World War II played their part. There were women auxiliaries like the Waves for the Navy and the Women's Air Corps. Women flew bombers across the country. They were built in Seattle, flew them to New York. There were, women at Army hospitals as nurses and whatnot. Women in the workplace, not just Rosie the Riveter, but also secretaries and office workers and stuff like that. During World War II, there was a huge opportunity for women to get into the workplace and demonstrate that they could do the women could do. But when the war was over with, rather than take that further, women went back to their traditional roles. They went and became housewives. They became mothers, members of the PTA, den mothers for the Cub Scouts, great bakers of brownies, things like that. So where you might think that the modern women's movement, like Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and all these notable women from the 1960s, the National Organization of Women, fighting for equal pay and equal rights, Title IX, and equal access and an equal rights amendment, and all that stuff. That doesn't come out of the women from World War II. That comes from their daughters. Okay? The baby boomers, the baby boomer girls who are born in 1945, they become the leaders of the women's movement in the 1960s. So these are the women's movement of the 60s are the daughters of the women who had fought in World War II but went back to more traditional roles. And you can see here, just in the advertisements from the 1950s, what the popular conception of women was. What was it? Housewife. Why weak? Why do you see weak there? What do you see?
Because you're less strong.
Yeah, exactly. Ooh, woman can open it. Wee. What?
That's the selling point of it. They're trying to get across, and that's kind of messed up.
It is. And you wouldn't know there's a black person living in the United States according to these ads. Yeah. Or a brown person, for that matter. American advertising, American television, American popular culture, what was sold to the American people in the 1950s was extraordinarily lily white. Okay, let's be honest. In terms of culture and the culture of affluence, rock and roll popular in the 1954, television, drive-in movies, fast food, convenience. A lot of it is centered around the automobile. The automobile becomes kind of a symbol of status. The cars become bigger, flashier, gaudier, tail fins and streamlined curves and stainless steel, and I mean all of it was meant to convey what? Modernity. Absolutely. There was and guys, what does that sound like? This embracing or the embracing of modernity through culture and art. Where did you see that previously? In the 20s. There is a great mental exercise, if we had time to do it, there is a great mental exercise here to compare the 1920s embracing of modernity with the 1950s embracing of modernity. You could look at Art Deco in the 1920s, you could look at automobiles in the 1950s, and there's a great little mental exercise to go on there. And why do you have that attitude? Where do you think that attitude of modernity and embracing modernity comes from? In the 20s and in the 50s? Well, yeah, so what does, and you're right, they both follow world wars. So where does and I don't know, I'm just getting you to think about it. Where do you think that embracing of modernity comes from as you're coming out of war? Yeah.
The focus is more domestic and not foreign, so.
Well, there is definitely a desire on the part of American people to turn away from world conflict and more toward, self-aggrandizement and self-fulfillment, and hey, let's look for the newest and the biggest and the best and the brightest and the shiniest and the, whatever baubles, whether it's radios in the 20s or televisions in the 50s. Whether it's a Model T in the 20s or whether it's a 57 Chevy in the 50s. Whether it, my dad restored a 57 Chevy the one time, bright yellow, with red pinstriping on it and like the stainless steel and the white panel on it. Beautiful. So so yeah, there's a okay. My brain just shut off for a second. I don't know why.
You're comparing the 20s to the 50s.
Right, comparing the 20s and the 50s, right. So yeah, now look, that is something that they could ask you on a free response question. And that is something I've seen as a trend over the past couple of years, where they'll ask you to compare cultural developments in the 20s and the 50s. Women's movement, 1848 to 1860, 1960 to 1972. They'll ask you to take an idea and look at it in two different time periods and compare what's the same, what's different. So be prepared for a question of that would come along like that, of that magnitude. Okay? And there are a lot of topics that you can do that with. Women there, women there. Labor there, labor there. Indians there, Indians there. Civil rights there, civil rights there. So I mean, you can do that with a number of topics and look at it in two different time periods and compare and contrast. All right. So these are kind of the icons of American culture. Hang on a second. This is not what I had. Yeah. Why did it not print out? Hang on. Okay, printed out the wrong one. All right, now this works. All right, so each slide will be a surprise for me, because what I'm following here doesn't match what's there. So anyway, that's okay. I've winged it before. Television. Television is to the 1950s what radio was to the 1920s. It is your information and entertainment box. It is the place around which the entire family gathers to get its news, its entertainment, and its information. So TV becomes part of the culture of the 1950s. And here's the thing. Anything that's going on around the world, now you can see it on TV. Anything that's going on here in the United States can now be broadcast on TV. And what do you think people are going to start to see on their television sets by the end of the 1950s and early 1960s that's going to have a significant impact on the way we think about our country? What are they now going to be able to see? Yes, racial tension. Absolutely. Martin Luther King, nonviolent protest, student sit-ins, marches, violence incurred against civil rights activists. That is all now going to be broadcast on TV, and Americans who don't live next to that I cannot turn a blind eye to it. They could ignore it before. They could hide under a pile of coats and pretend everything was okay. But when you have a television in everyone's house, that's going to lead to a national consciousness of what is going on. I would argue television is the greatest single contributor to the advancement of civil rights, because the American people see this, and the world sees it, and says, wait a minute, you Americans, you claim to be the land of liberty and freedom and democracy, and yet this is going on. You're turning fire hoses on protesters. So yeah, television. The suburbs, the affordability of housing, and the creation of what are called Levitt towns or prefab cookie cutter homes. Housing becomes affordable for the average person. For the great majority of the American middle class, William Levitt does for homes what Henry Ford did for the automobile. He creates homes as a mass production assembly line idea. Although, I mean, it's not built on an assembly line, but all the parts are prefabricated and delivered to the site and assembled in a very quick manner. Now, I can tell you, after looking at a number of Levitt homes where my closing date on my house is May 29th, so we sold our house. We're moving on May 29th over to the old section of property. And all the houses we were looking at were Levitt houses. They were literally built by the Levitt Corporation in 1954. And what do you think I was, now that's 1954, so between the houses over in Crofton, the ones we were looking at built by Levitt, they were built, I want to say 68, 69, 70. Levitt went out of business in the late 70s. What do you think are some of the issues I was finding as I was looking at homes?
Stuff's cheap.
Stuff is
Not very
cheap.
well put together.
You're darn right. Most of the people, have you worked on any of these Levitt homes? Yeah, they are cheaply built. Most of the people who are friends of ours over in Old Crofton have had to replace all the plumbing. They've had to replace all the wiring in the home. They used aluminum wire rather than copper wire, and that aluminum wire burns right out. So yeah, there is a cost to cheap. We bought a house. It's not a Levitt house. We bought a house that was built by another company, much better construction. Yeah, and hey, yeah, I'll pay $460,000 for a house with much better construction. I never thought I'd ever say that. I'll pay $460,000 for a house. Anyway, I have a $3,000 mortgage. I will not be doing anything for the next 25 years. Yeah, $3,000 a month.
Oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
More than a
It's yeah, it's about my monthly paycheck. Month, 2 paychecks.
How will you eat?
Bologna sandwiches, my friends. Bologna
Fried
sandwiches.
bologna sandwiches.
Fried bologna. Don't knock fried bologna.
That's right.
Uh,
I can't say nothing about it.
Now, with the ability to manufacture these homes, and a lot of these prefab suburbs are built near, large metropolitan areas. Like, for instance, what you're seeing there is Greenbelt, Maryland. A lot of the towns in this area, Greenbelt, New Carrollton, Columbia, Bowie, Crofton, they were all built in the 50s and 60s as Levitt towns. Matter of fact, Bowie was supposed to be called Levittown, Maryland, and then they called it Bowie. There you go. So yeah, and look, who's going to move to these Levitt towns? If you're moving from the cities to the suburbs, who's going to move into these suburban, idyllic settings? Families, sure. Baby boomer, people with new children, yeah. White people. Come on, folks, let's not be shy about this, okay? White people are going to take their money from the inner city where they're living, or the exurbs around where they're living, and they're going to take their money and their family, and they're going to move to the safety and security of these suburban enclaves, away from the crime, and away from the dangers, and away from the problems, and let's be honest, away from the people who don't look like them. So what is going to happen to the major cities of America as a result of this suburbanization?
They're going to get some populated like
They're going to what?
it's the populated African Americans.
They are going to become majority African American population centers. What else is going to happen? Since these people with their money
Oh,
are
they're going to become
Poverty.
poor.
there's going to be poverty, the tax base in these cities is going to decline, and you're going to see the devolution of the inner cities of America. Detroit, Camden, Newark, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, all these cities that had been, let's call them polyglot cities. That means you had a large variety of different enclaves and neighborhoods. A lot of those white people are going to move out of those cities, and you're going to wind up with cities that are predominantly African American, predominantly impoverished, very few opportunities. And when you have very few opportunities and not a lot of money, you're going to wind up having a large crime rate, and it's just going to feed on itself until you do something about it. You know, one of the first cities to actually do something about inner city poverty was Baltimore in 1978. Do you know what they did? Think about Baltimore. Baltimore had turned into just a den of crime and poverty. Not but but like I tell visitors, there's good Baltimore and there's bad Baltimore. But the inner harbor.
All the stuff is redone.
The inner harbor was this idea in the 1970s and 80s that became very popular called urban revitalization. And what you do is you build something. You build something that people will come to see. The aquarium and the inner harbor are the anchor for the revitalization of Baltimore between Lombard and Pratt Street. But the revitalization of Baltimore. And a lot of cities around the country have been doing that since the 70s. But Baltimore was really the first city to try something like that. And some places it succeeds. In Baltimore, it succeeded greatly. I mean, people come to Baltimore all the time to go to the aquarium or go to the inner harbor or go to Canton or, you know, all the other little enclaves. And people have been moving back to the cities. And you have this idea, I don't know if you've ever heard of this, it's called gentrification, where the cities now are experiencing an influx of wealth and an influx of people and an influx of businesses. Washington, D.C., for instance, in the 1970s, and I'm not trying to be cute here. I'm trying to tell you what they referred to Washington, D.C. as in the 1970s. They referred to it as Chocolate City, because it was 90% black. Today, the majority of the black population in Washington, D.C. is below 50%. That's because of gentrification, because people have been moving back to the cities, bringing their money, bringing their businesses back to the cities. And they've become a lot more diverse. Some cities it works. Baltimore, it worked. Camden, New Jersey, did not work. Yeah.
So when you say the black population in DC is below 50%,
Yeah.
is that because they pretty much all this gentrification brought so much wealth and all that and upped cost of living and they had to go somewhere else, or is it because they actually moved up in life?
The gentrification raised property values, raised taxes, and forced a lot of the black population in those areas to seek other places. And where did they wind up going? Not Baltimore. PG County. Exactly. Or Charles County. So, yeah. I mean, talking about race and urbanization and suburbanization, especially in this area, is fascinating stuff. I mean, I could do it forever. But yeah, just so you're aware that there is it's called white flight. but it is essentially white middle-class people moving to the suburbs to get away from the crime, poverty, and diversity, read what you will, of the inner cities. And so what you're going to see is a great deal of movement in America. A move from what's called the Rust Belt, the cities, the industrial centers of the Northeast, like Cleveland and Toledo and Akron and Erie and Detroit and Chicago and Gary, Indiana, and yeah, I'm just trying to think of cities that are just absolute holes in the ground today. People are going to move from those cities to warmer climates, drier climates, cheaper places to live, and that's predominantly the South and the West. $460,000 buys me a 1979 house with 2,100 square feet in it, in this area. I take my $461,000, technically $461,000. I take my $461,000 and go to North Carolina.
Oh my God.
Brother, I can buy myself a mansion.
That's right, good.
Okay? Absolutely. Real estate prices are cheaper in the South and in the West. And you are going to see a movement, an influx of people moving to places like California, like Texas, like Florida. So much so that these states become uber important politically. I mean, the largest political centers in this country used to be New York and Pennsylvania and Ohio. Now it's California. California is the most populous state in the Union. Texas. How many freaking presidents have we had from Texas in the past 40 years, 50 years? Guys, I'm going to show you the importance of the South and the West. What becomes known as, I know I'm getting out of turn here, but the sagebrush. In the 1980s, this change from the Northeast to the South and the West as the political center of gravity is known as the sagebrush revolution. Southerners, Westerners, conservatives, white conservatives, that gets you the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Ronald Reagan, prior to being president of the United States, and after he was an actor, what was he? Does anybody know? He was governor of California. Guys, take a look at where people are from. Okay, after Kennedy. Texas, California, he's a hiccup. Because Nixon resigned. Georgia, California. George Bush was born in Connecticut, but he ran from Texas out of Houston. Arkansas, Texas, Illinois. Barack Obama is the first president we've had elected from the Northeast since Kennedy. That's how much the South and the West have dominated politics in this country. And it's because of this movement of people. Now, how are they able to move? Because in the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower builds the interstate highway. That's going to be there, isn't it? It's going to be there. Dwight Eisenhower undertakes the construction of the interstate highway system. It's called the Highway Act of 1955, and it builds this network of highways across the country in a grid-like fashion. Look at that. There's order to that. And I mean, are there people in here that don't know the pattern of the highways? Don't know the number ordering of the highway? Do you know that there's a pattern to that? Yeah, it's even east-west. North-south is zeros and fives, or odd, but no, wait, no. It's odd numbers north-south, and then even numbers east-west. So Interstate 90 is up here, Interstate 80 is here, 70 is there, 60 is somewhere. 50 actually runs through. I mean, technically 50, US 50 is Interstate 50. And then 40 runs from the Carolina coast out to California.
Like Route 10 runs down.
Yeah, Route 10 runs along the Gulf Coast.
One.
Huh? Oh yeah, I know. H1, the H2, and the H3. I know. But yeah, here's 95, and then here's Route 5. Okay, so it goes, 5, 15, 25, 35, 45, 55 across the country. Why did Eisenhower do this? So that you could get from Maine to Disney World quickly? Yeah.
You can move on the military.
Yes. This is a Cold War measure. You have these wide highways that are built to accommodate our tanks and our missile trucks. You just get to use the highways when we're not in a time of war. But they are a national security project. But look, man, it allows you to move anywhere in the country quickly, rapidly. And so, really, I gotta do this? Remind me not to draw. Everything will be a surprise. All right. This idea of the American dream, the suburban, affluent, buy enough stuff for your children, give them the things they want, put them in a school where they're nice and safe and taken care of, and they're given all the nice things and the opportunity to play baseball and join the Cub Scouts and you get this medal and that award and that award. And, have you had enough sunshine blown at you? That's the American dream of the 1950s. A very lily white American dream. Anybody recognize that? No fans of 1950s television? I mean, every freaking family on TV looked like that in the 1950s. This is Leave It to Beaver.
Oh.
There you go. Really?
Is that other show where they're like whistling and they're like, bitch?
Andy Griffith show.
Yeah, there.
Now there were those.
You can tell Mrs. Smith don't watch the show.
Now there were those who looked at this white bread suburban cookie cutter America and said, "This is insane." They did not like the idea, and you were expected to conform. If you were a radical, if you were a rebel, if you were a person who thought otherwise, people looked at you weird. Maybe you got labeled as a communist, especially during that Red Scare. But there were those who looked at this white bread cookie cutter, everybody's the same, one of us type existence and said, this is not for me. Now, this idea of conformity is promoted by, the Red Scare and McCarthyism. Why is it not coming through? My God. What is the Met? Hold on.
Don't break the screen. Don't break it.
Oh, there goes my chair. Why that's there, I have no idea. Why that's there, I have no idea. Why that's there, I have no idea. Where are no idea. I have no idea. Okay. Look, a lot of this conformity of the 1950s comes out of the fear and paranoia of being possibly labeled a subversive. McCarthyism, the Red Scare, Richard Nixon and his investigations, like the Alger investigation, leads to a great deal of fear. I don't want to be labeled a subversive. I don't want to be labeled a communist. I don't want to be labeled a socialist. People were being named. People were being dragged before the Congress. They were making blacklists of people. If you were even hinted at as being a communist, you couldn't get a job. They would write your name down, and you wouldn't be able to get a job anywhere. They targeted, in particular, Hollywood. A lot of actors who in the 1930s had been experimenting with communism or investigating communism during the Depression. A lot of those people were painted with this broad brush that they were somehow subversive or members of the Communist Party, and people were encouraged to out other actors. But other people became targets. College professors, people who had been involved in the New Deal, liberals, a lot of Democrats were accused of being socialists, and that hasn't ended either. But yeah, and this guy McCarthy would get up and he would say, I've got a list of 200 known communists working in Hollywood, or I've got a list of 300 known communists working in the State Department. And people would be like, oh, well, he knows these people are communists. Well, let's root them out. Let's find them. It's when he goes after the U.S. Army and he starts investigating the military that the government finally pushes back against Joseph McCarthy. And a lot of what ends McCarthyism is the reporting of CBS News and Edward R. Murrow. And they reveal that McCarthy's nothing but a bully, nothing but a blowhard, a guy with absolutely no substantive evidence. A lot of those lists were fake. A lot of his attacks were attacks against political enemies just because he wanted to attack them. And what McCarthy was counting on was the ignorance of the American people. That they wouldn't question what the government was doing. They wouldn't question what the Senate was doing. Yeah.
Why would it matter if one person said they were communist? Because their government isn't communist. So they can just say, I'm communist.
I don't understand the question.
Why would it matter if one person?
If Senator McCarthy's committee accuses you of being a communist, you would be dragged before the committee. You would be questioned. You would be under oath. And you would have to answer their questions. And if they found even a hint of a line in your testimony, you could go to jail. And the idea was that in order for you to get protection, you would have to name people that you thought were suspected of being communist. And then they would be brought before the committee. And all this was an attempt by McCarthy and Nixon and other people who, practiced this thing of keeping the microphone and the camera on them. The longer this went on, the longer they got the national spotlight. I mean, Nixon parlays the Alger Hiss case into getting elected vice president of the United States. Yeah.
I mean, a little off topic, but don't they do basically the same thing for unexpected drug, like, hey, if you rat these people out, then you're free to go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was some drug kingpin who managed to get like an 80-year-old man in prison for like 15 years because of that whole bureaucratic line of
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, anybody who was perceived as different, liberals, professors, what they called, there was a derisive term in the 1950s for academics. They called them eggheads. Yeah. So it was, look, this idea, and I cannot stand, and I don't care if my political views come out on this one or not, I cannot stand anti-intellectualism. This idea that being an intellectual is somehow a negative trait. Oh, you guys all, you smarty pants with your know-it-all stuff there. You know what? Being dumb, being ignorant is not a virtue. I'm sorry, people seem to wear that as a badge of honor. Well, I don't need to know anything. I go with what's in my gut. God almighty, really? A lot of people looked at the 1950s as the world of tomorrow. Yeah, you like that transition? Because the 1950s is a time of innovation, of science, of technology. They would always have these films, the highway of tomorrow, the automobile of tomorrow, the kitchen of tomorrow. And people would, they'd be like, oh, wow, man. And look, there were a lot of things that you could look at. And I still don't have a flying car. I don't know where my flying car is. The Jetsons promised me a flying car. I have no flying car. What?
Back to the Future has flying cars.
Back to the Future. Look, Back to the Future was when I was in school. Okay. Yeah, I'm dating myself. I understand. I went and saw Back to the Future like 6 times that summer. That was such an awesome movie. Huh?
You have to wait for tomorrow for your flying car.
That's right. And technically, I mean, the flying DeLorean is at the end of Back to the Future. But yeah, all right. So, but there were a lot of things that were happening in the 1950s that were amazing technological innovations. For instance, Jonas Salk developed the polio vaccine. Now, I think this is the last time we actually cured a disease. Think about it. What's the disease after polio that we've cured? Diabetes? No, you can live with it. AIDS? No, you can live with it. What they do is I know I'm getting to my Chris Rock routine here. The money isn't in the cure. The money's in the medicine.
Right.
The pharmaceutical companies are like drug dealers, but they're legal. They make it so you can live with the disease, and they've got repeat customers. I mean, you got that insulin. You need that insulin, man. You got to keep coming back for the insulin and the syringes. With AIDS, you got to keep coming back for the AZT and the other cocktails that are involved there. They make it so that you can live with it. This is the last time I think we cured a disease, polio, and it came a lot through the donations of the March of Dimes. A lot of the research that was funded by a lot of the research that Jonas Salk did on polio was funded through the March of Dimes. And who is on the dime? Yes. Why is he on the dime? Because he had polio. And Franklin Roosevelt spent his entire adult life, yes, he was president, but in his spare time, he was trying to find a cure for polio. He was trying to find a cure for polio until the day he died. And Franklin Roosevelt not only founded the Warm Springs Rehabilitation Complex in Georgia for sufferers of polio, he also founded the March of Dimes to get kids to get donations to fund polio research, and it was the March of Dimes research money that found a cure. Granted, it was like 10 years after FDR died, but so well, the March of Dimes has diversified since then. But yeah, when I hear these folks out there saying, you know what, we should get rid of FDR on the dime and put Ronald Reagan on the dime. I'm like, dude, do you understand why FDR is on the dime? He's there for a freaking reason. Oh, I don't need to know nothing.
People have said that?
Huh?
People have said that?
People have said that.
Mr. Smith, have they said it to you?
No, they haven't said it to me.
Oh my God.
We don't-
I don't want to see that. Oh man.
The first computers were built in the 1950s. Granted, they were the size of a room.
I got one of those.
But yes, I mean, all of that does what a microchip does today.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
So UNIVAC was the first computer built by IBM. That's right, International Business Machines. But we were also using science to build bigger and better bombs. The hydrogen bomb. It wasn't enough to blow up one Hiroshima. You had to blow up 100 Hiroshimas in one bomb. And then you could take those bombs and put them on top of rockets. The intercontinental ballistic missile made it possible for worldwide nuclear Armageddon in about 30 minutes or less. Or your next Armageddon is free. But yeah, the Americans developed rockets, the Russians developed rockets, the Americans develop a hydrogen bomb, the Russians develop a hydrogen bomb, they tip their missiles with all of these nuclear bombs, and so they're capable of destroying the planet several times over by the middle of the 1950s. You know, and what do Americans do besides duck and cover videos? Yeah, they build or bomb shelters. Like that's going to save them. Does anybody have a bomb shelter in their backyard?
But I've seen.
Yeah. But yeah, that was a popular thing. And hey, you know what scared the pants off of people in the 50s? Sputnik.
Yeah.
That freaked people out. Why? It's a satellite. It's a satellite.
They're spying on us.
It's up in space.
They're looking at us.
And you know what? The other night, the International Space Station flew over. And yeah. Okay. Wow.
Michaela, where are you?
Office chair. All right.
Why does it look like that? Why did they make it so weird?
There's like antennas.
Those are the antennas. Yeah, I mean, this is the first satellite. So anyway, so we go outside, we look up, and there's the International Space Station flying over from northwest to southeast, you know, and we're saying, hey, well, look at that, you know, and you can see it, you know, it's pretty impressive. Yeah, the American people are looking up in 1957, and there is a Russian object flying over their head. That panicked the American people, because if they can launch a satellite above my head, they can drop a nuclear bomb on my head. So that's why there is a great deal of emphasis in the 1950s on the space race. You know, the Russian, by the way, the 50s and early 60s, the Russians beat us at everything. First satellite, the Russians. First man in space, actually first animal in space, Laika the dog. Laika the dog was put up in an orbiting device and never came back. Poor Laika. First man in space, the Russians. First man in orbit, the Russians. First woman in space, the Russians. They beat us at everything. That's why Kennedy says in 1961, it should be the goal of this nation before this decade is out to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the earth. That's why I have the formation of NASA.
Yeah, it's that fun.
But despite all this, there is what is called the other America. There is another America out there that is not white bread, that is not moving to the suburbs, that is not embracing.
South America.
Huh? No, it's not South America, that's for sure. Michael Harrington wrote a book, and it came out, I think, in 1960. So it came out at the end of the 50s. But he did a decade-long investigation of the 1950s, where he was looking at the impact of white flight out of the inner cities. And he basically said that the inner cities had become culturally and socially untenable, and that something needed to be done to grapple with poverty, grapple with crime, grapple with a lack of decent housing, grapple with the breakup of a lot of African American families. There was a lot of instability among African American families. Harrington shines a spotlight on this in what's called The Other America. And a lot of people point to this book as being the influence for Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs of 1964, where he's trying to break the cycle of poverty through education programs and housing programs and welfare and food stamps and other anti-poverty programs to try to give people, a leg up. You also had beatniks in the 1950s. These were your real critics of conformity. These are the guys that looked at that white bread cookie cutter suburban lifestyle and said, no way, man, that's not for me. That's not hip. It's not cool, baby. These are the guys who really kind of challenged the white conservative, stale establishment, huh? The beatniks kind of give way in the 60s to the hippie movement. Exactly, that's right. With the beatniks, if you've ever heard of, for God's sake, is it in this presentation or not? I'll tell you what, I am so out of sorts with this presentation here. Anyway, there were a lot of beatnik writers, like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, David Reisman. These guys wrote about individuality. They wrote about challenging conformity. They wrote about expressing your individual spirit. Now, a lot of it was drug-induced. If anybody has ever seen, has anybody seen the movie a couple of years ago, On the Road? It's based on the book by Jack Kerouac, On the Road. Jack Kerouac was a Columbia University football star, which doesn't really say much because Columbia University's football program stinks. But he was this clean-cut, crew-cut, all-American football star who got involved in drugs, dropped out of Columbia University, and went on this vision quest across the country, just kind of hitchhiking across the country, and writing about his experiences. Ginsberg also did that. Kind of a modern day example of a beatnik would be a guy like Hunter S. Thompson, if you've ever heard of him.
Gonzo journalism. Yeah,
gonzo journalism comes out of this beatnik movement of the 50s, absolutely. You also had rebels, and there was concern about juvenile delinquency and the embracing of ne'er-do-wells like James Dean and other leather-jacketed, T-shirted, cigarette rolled up in it people. There was, there was concern about gang violence in schools and, students who wouldn't listen to their teachers in the 50s. So you had that. You had critics of the vanilla conformity, like Sloan Wilson's The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, where you see all these people who go to work, they live in the suburbs, they go to work in the cities, they work in these humdrum middle management jobs, and there's absolutely no life to them, nothing interesting about them. Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, actually, the interesting thing about this guy who lives a very humdrum life is that he fathered a child while he was a veteran in the war in Europe. So that's kind of the sriracha in that story there. Politically, Eisenhower is elected in 1952. He does not reject the New Deal. Okay, he is not going to get rid of government programs, but he believes in what he calls dynamic conservatism. He says conservative when it comes to money, liberal when it comes to human beings. Yeah, I don't think there's anybody out there like that, except for me. I can't find a politician out there. I mean, that's my political philosophy in a nutshell, right there. And I can't find anybody who will subscribe to that. Most New Deal programs are kept in place. Social Security kept in place. A lot of the FDIC and the Securities and Exchange Commission, a lot of that regulatory stuff that had been put in place during the Roosevelt years, that's kept in place. He even, he funds the public works of the interstate highway system. It's the largest public works project in American history. With regard to the Cold War, Eisenhower relies on his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles. And they kind of form like a triumvirate, Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers. And they promote this idea of massive retaliation, the New Look defense, the triad, what Eisenhower called more bang for the buck. Why have an army of 500,000 men when one nuclear bomb could do the work of 500,000 men? That's the idea of more bang for the buck. Eisenhower wanted to rethink the military. Less emphasis on people, more emphasis on technology. So, you wind up with high-altitude bombers, ballistic missile nuclear submarines, hydrogen bombs, and this idea that we could build up our military to the point where we would be able to deliver what he called a massive retaliation. The Russians would be stupid to attack us because they know it would be their certain death. And that's why he emphasizes that it's called the New Look defense. Emphasis on technology, less emphasis on people. And the belief that if either side started a nuclear war, it would be mutually assured destruction. So that's where we're at in the 1950s. Both sides have huge nuclear arsenals, nuclear submarines, high-altitude bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the capacity to destroy each other several times over. So a nuclear war is unthinkable because it's unwinnable. And you've got that kind of stalemate. Eisenhower believed also, not just in containment, this is his take on containment, not just to contain the Russians, but to start to pick them off. Roll them back. Maybe we could try and get a couple of these communist countries to flip. And so the CIA in 1954-55 is going to convince Hungarian rebels to rise up against their Hungarian communist government with the promise that we will help them out. The CIA would provide them with funds and guns and equipment and supplies to help them out in rebelling against the communist government of Hungary. The Hungarians do their part. They rise up. They launch a rebellion. They overthrow the Hungarian government. And then they say, all right, America, where's the aid? And America doesn't show up with aid. America doesn't show up with supplies. We leave them hanging there with their cheese in the wind. Why? Why do you think America left the Hungarians hanging?
Good morning, Southern. Today is Friday, April 25th, a V-Day. Please stand for your Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please be seated. Attention National Honor Society members, there is a mandatory
If we
meeting
help
on
out the
Wednesday, April
Hungarians,
30th during Bulldog Block.
the Russians are going to come in and help the communists.
Attention new
You've got
NHS
Americans on one
inductees.
side and
Please
Russians
return
on the
your
other. They've got
uniforms
guns,
to
they've got
survival,
tanks. You start
by the
World
end of
War
today.
III. Is Eisenhower really
The
willing to
JV
start
Girls
World
Hockey
War
Team won
III
13-1
over
in
Hungary?
by Ray
No.
Moore and Ali
And
Cox.
so Eisenhower realizes
This
the limits
Saturday
to
from 10
rollback.
a.m. to 12, we will be working on our Marvin
What happened
Memorial
to
Garden.
Hungary?
Come
A
help
lot
us
of them
with
got
our
arrested
Ready
and
Kitchen
either
Day.
executed
We'll
or
be
thrown
meeting
in
down
prison.
at the turf field.
Yeah.
So little.
Seniors, if you did not pick up your announcements from Jostens at lunch is on Tuesday, see Miss Jost to get your order.
AP students, there's an AP schedule posted in the hallways upstairs at the testing office in the library and in the cafeteria. Next Tuesday and Wednesday, you must complete your pre-admin, so don't be late to school on those days. Check your rosters today.
You guys are doing your
AP
pre-administration.
registration payments are due now. Your account must be paid in full before testing begins. All test takers
You
should
guys
have
are doing your
received an amount.
pre-administration
If you need to discuss
on
this with the school test
A
coordinator,
day
see Ms. Kurtz now, not
next
later.
week, second
AP and
period.
HSA test takers, listen up. Please let Ms. Kurtz know if you experience a medical
you know what,
condition that
I-
will impact your performance of testing. For example, broken hands, arms, surgery, illness, so she can work with you to get assistance for your testing. Attention, seniors! Did you attend Lothian Elementary? Are you planning to attend college in the fall? Lothian Elementary is offering a $500 scholarship to a Southern High
Maybe,
student.
I don't know.
Applications
You have to
are
look
invited
at
and
it.
the
I don't
deadline
know.
is Friday, May 2nd.
All course verification change forms are due back by the end of the day. If you did not pick up them